As most of you know, we spent the last several weeks wrapping our minds around some of the most meaningful and memorable words ever spoken. And of course, I'm talking about Jesus' celebrated Sermon on the Mount, which contains some of the most memorable and remarkable teaching in Scripture. Recorded in Matthew 5 through 7, the sermon, of course, begins with the Beatitudes. And then Jesus talks about his followers being the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And then from there, he starts diving into some of the Old Testament commandments and teachings. He parallels anger and murder, warning us of the dangers of harsh and hateful words. And then Jesus parallels adultery with lust and divorce, which we talked about last week. He warns against sexual depravity and senseless divorces and encourages us to have steadfast devotion both to our partners and to our promises. And as we approach the end of Matthew 5, Jesus has just a little bit more to say about our relationships. And this time, he talks to us about our adversaries and enemies. And I don't know if it was intentional or not that he follows the subject of divorce with how to treat your enemies, but there could be a correlation there since our exes often end up being our enemies. But in any case, if you have a Bible or an app on your phone and you want to follow along, I want to read these next three paragraphs as one big segment and then kind of break it up. So this reading will be a little longer than usual. But it begins in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." In these 3 paragraphs, Jesus warns us against 3 attitudes and actions that threaten our relationships with other people. Essentially, he says to avoid 3 things. And first, he says to avoid hostility. Avoid hostility. And Jesus, once again, he starts by quoting the Old Testament. He says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38, "You have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Now, this quote comes from Exodus 21, verse 24, and it's also repeated a couple other places in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And while this law sounds harsh and severe to us, it actually prevented escalating hostilities. When people hurt us, often our first reaction is to retaliate. The desire to get even seems to be woven into the human psyche. Revenge and retaliation are just natural instincts. It reminds me of a story about a mother who was in the kitchen working. She heard her little boy scream. So she goes running down the room and she finds her toddler with a fistful of his hair. And she helps the baby unclench her hand, and she just says to the little boy, "I'm so sorry." She doesn't know what it's like to have her hair pulled. So she goes back to the kitchen. Before she even gets to the dishes, she hears another scream, turns around, runs to see what it is. And she says, "What happened?" And the little boy says, "Now she knows." That seems to be the way it works, isn't it? Rather than settling conflicts, revenge just escalates them. Because we never just get even, do we? We always get just a little more than even. And the eye for an eye command was intended to put a limit on vengeance, to prevent escalation and ensure that the punishment fit the crime. But Jesus says that's not even enough. He says instead of getting even, don't retaliate at all. And he gives 3 examples of hostile situations that could easily escalate. First, he says in verse 39, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. And this is one of the most famous lines in the Sermon on the Mount, often summarized simply, turn the other cheek. And a slap on the right cheek was typically a blow from the backhand. My right cheek, if somebody hit me, they're most likely right-handed, and so that would be a backhanded slap on the right cheek. And to backhand someone in Jewish culture was an act of contempt. It was a great insult. And so the person who got slapped usually responded in one of 2 ways. Either they would attack, like they would take that smack as a challenge and then start throwing punches, or if they had a little bit more composure, they would sue. Backhanding someone in Jewish culture was actually against the law, and it came with a hefty fine. But both of those options would just escalate the situation. And so Jesus says to turn the other cheek. In other words, don't engage at all. If somebody backhands you, if they're challenging you, if they're insulting you or putting you down, just don't engage. Don't respond at all. And then he gives another example. He says in verse 40, he says, if you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. Now this has got to be, and I don't know if this is what Jesus had in mind when he created this scenario, but it sounds like a pretty small claim, isn't it? Someone goes to the trouble of dragging you into court just to take your shirt from you. That's a pretty petty person. But what makes this command really compelling is that a person's coat, their cloak, was considered a sacred possession. In fact, under God's law in Exodus 22, verse 26 and 27, it said that no one could take another person's cloak. And God had reasons for that. He said, the cloak was used for a variety of things. It was used as a blanket at night. It was used for a coat during the day. It could be stuffed with belongings and used as a sack to carry things. There was just a dozen different things that people used their cloak for. And God said, that might be that person's only cloak. And so you cannot take it, period. It is against the law to take someone's cloak. Even if you loaned it as collateral or gave it to somebody to borrow, that person had to return it by the end of the day or they would be in trouble. It was the one possession that no one could take away from you. But Jesus says to avoid hostility, to prevent things from escalating and getting worse, just take it off and give it to them. That's not even what they're trying to get. They're trying to take something else from you, and he says, take your cloak and say, here. You can give them the one thing that they cannot take from you. And then finally, Jesus uses one last example. He says in verse 41, if a soldier demands that you carry his gear for 1 mile, carry it 2 miles. And again, this is another one of those really famous sayings from the Sermon on the Mount. When someone goes above and beyond expectations, we'll say that he or she really went the 2nd mile. We talk about people going the 2nd mile all the time. Well, in Jesus' day, all of Judea was under Roman occupation. And according to Roman law, the Roman soldiers could demand that any citizen carry their belongings for up to 1,000 paces. That's what it literally is. It's 1,000 paces, which is roughly a mile, and that's why we translate it that way. So they could just walk up to any random person on the street and say, here's my sword, my shield, my stuff, carry it, we're going. And they would have to oblige. And the Jews hated this. It was just a constant reminder of their subjugation, their oppression from the Romans, that it was humiliating to them to have to carry this soldier's stuff when they didn't want to be under Roman law in the first place. And a lot of the Jews would complain about it. Many of them threatened rebellion or insurrection, but Jesus proposes a different way. And what would happen if after carrying the soldier's gear for 1,000 paces, you volunteered to go another 1,000 paces? And what would happen in your life if you went above and beyond expectations and what's required of you at work or at school or at home? You might not have any choice about the first mile, but the second mile, that's up to you. And so each of these examples demonstrates how responding the right way in a hostile situation can de-escalate things. The problem with an eye for an eye is that everybody ends up blind. Peter summed up Jesus' teaching this way. He says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, "Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. That is what God has called you to do, and He will bless you for it." By repaying evil with a blessing, we'll avoid hostility, we'll prevent things from escalating. And furthermore, on a very related note, Jesus urges us to avoid hatred. Avoid hatred. Again, he begins by quoting the Old Testament. He says in verse 43, "You have heard the law that says, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.'" Now, right off the bat, you need to notice that only the first part here, the love your neighbor part, is in quotes, and not the hate your enemy part. That's because the quote of loving your neighbor comes from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. That's actually found in the Old Testament. The part about hating your enemies, that's not actually found in the Old Testament. That was kind of added on over time. You see, Jewish rabbis interpreted the word neighbor to include only people of the same race and the same faith. So essentially, other good Jews would be included in the term neighbor, but anybody else was exempt. So they're like, I don't have to love anyone other than my neighbor, therefore I can hate whoever is not my neighbor. Of course, Jesus explained in the parable of the Good Samaritan that neighbor includes everyone. But here, he simply makes the point that hatred, even hatred for your enemies, is never acceptable. Instead, Jesus says in verse 44, "But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you." And then he adds in verse 46, he says, there should be another slide there, "If you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that?" See, this command is quite possibly one of the most outrageous things Jesus ever said. Avoiding hostility is primarily about our actions and reactions, but avoiding hatred, that's a matter of the heart. And most of us are okay with the, love one another commands. We're all just one big happy family here. We love each other. And we're typically okay with the love your neighbor commands. But the idea of loving your enemies and praying for them, and I don't think Jesus has in mind the Lord, give this guy what he's got coming to him kind of prayer when he says to pray for your enemies. No, he wants us to hope for and pray for the best for the people who are the worst to us. And Jesus and his audience, again, they lived under this oppressive, occupying Roman government, and the Romans employed torture and murder to keep people in line. So everyone listening to Jesus talking about loving their enemies, their first thought probably went to the Romans, and they had plenty of opportunities to experience the "I hate you with every ounce of my guts" kind of enemies in the soldiers and prefects that carried out this daily social domination. But this command, it extends past military and monarchy type enemies. It includes, the random inconsiderate jerks who pop up occasionally in your life. The guy at work that keeps stealing your lunch, or the lady who cut you off on the highway and gave you the finger. Elsewhere, Jesus put it this way. He said in Luke chapter 6, "I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you." Anyone who hates you, who hurts you, who curses you is your enemy. And Jesus calls us to love those people. Do good to them, bless them, pray for them. And that's not easy. It's not easy to love your enemies, the vow breakers, the truth benders, the money grubbers, the backstabbers that we meet, that we work with, that we're sometimes related to. And how do you love people that are hard to love? Our typical strategy is to, try harder, dig deeper, strain more. We're going to love that person if it kills us, and it just might. But the truth is, you may not be capable of loving that person, but God is. And God is in you. When we love the people who hate us, when we're kind to the people who are unkind to us, when we bless those who curse us, we demonstrate God's love living in us. We allow His love to flow through us. Max Lucado, in his book, Just Like Jesus, describes God's love like this. He says, God's love never ceases, never. Though we spurn Him, ignore Him, reject Him, disobey Him, He will not change. Our evil cannot diminish His love. Our goodness cannot increase it. Our faith doesn't earn it any more than our stupidity jeopardizes it. God doesn't love us less if we fail and more if we succeed. God's love never ceases. And the Bible puts it this way very similarly. In Romans 5, verse 8, God showed His great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners, while we were still His enemies. We were God's enemies, and yet He loved us enough to sacrifice Jesus to make us His friends. If God can love His enemies like that, then surely He can help us to love ours. So first, Jesus tells us to avoid hostility. Further, He tells us to avoid hatred. And finally, Jesus tells us to avoid hypocrisy. Avoid hypocrisy. Now, as Jesus continues into chapter 6, and by the way, you all know that the chapters and verse headings and stuff like that aren't part of Scripture originally. Matthew didn't pause and say chapter 6, verse 1. And it's all added later on. So this was just one continuous thought as Jesus was speaking. But He says there in the beginning of verse 6, don't do your good deeds publicly to be admired by others, for you will lose the reward from your Father in heaven. When you give to someone in need, don't do as the hypocrites do, blowing trumpets in the synagogues and streets to call attention to their acts of charity. I tell you the truth, they have received all the reward they will ever get. The word hypocrite, as you may know, comes from the Greek theater. It was the Greek word for actors who wore masks and performed on stage. Unfortunately, it's also a fairly good word to describe some people who claim to follow Christ. And here Jesus applies the word hypocrite to people who do good acts for appearances only, and to be praised by people, not out of compassion or other godly motives. And these hypocrites liked to toot their own horns, bragging about their good deeds and their generosity. While their actions may have been good, their motives were hollow. Like actors in a play, they give their gifts in front of an audience hoping to receive applause. And Jesus sees right through that sort of show. And so do most people, I think. It reminds me of a story about a little boy who attended his baby sister's baby dedication. The family was really excited about it, and they invited all their family and friends to attend church with them that day. And they got all dressed up in their Sunday best, and they put like the prettiest little dress gown thing on the baby. And on the way home after the service, the little boy, who's like 5 years old, starts crying. And the dad's like, well, what's wrong? And the little boy said, that preacher said that you made you promise that you would raise us in a Christian home. And the dad says, yeah, what's wrong with that? And the little boy says, well, I want to live with you and Mommy. See, when we give of our time, our talent, and our treasure, we need to be sure that we're doing it for the right reasons. Motives matter. Few things can repel a person from God as efficiently as a hypocritical Christian. Bottom line is, don't make a production out of your faith. So about midway through His famous Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives us these three things to avoid. Avoid hostility, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. Avoid hatred, love your enemies, pray for the people that are persecuting you. And avoid hypocrisy. Stop looking for applause and just do the right thing for the right reasons. Next week, we'll continue our study of the Sermon on the Mount. And in the meantime, if you've got some hostility in your life or hatred in your heart, and you could use someone to talk to about it, I'd love to help. And you can pull me aside after church, or you can call me at home. But first, you should talk to God. While the rest of us stand and sing this next song, I want to encourage you to just stand and pray. Tell God what's going on. Let Him know where this anger and this hostility and this hatred comes from, and ask Him to help you just let it go. So in the meantime, let's all stand and sing together, church.